University of Calgary. And we have sort of a little research cluster around energy transition and deindustrialization, which includes this term to Fulbright scholars who are Canada research chairs in energy transition and deindustrialization. And we know that there are quite a number of depot members who are interested in this topic. And so we thought we'll put this workshop or this roundtable together. Please feel free to reach out to us after this if you also work in this area, if you're interested in this kind of topic. We definitely see this as a starting point, and we want to continue our conversation in other forum and ways. And I'll pass it on to Greg Wilson, who has kindly agreed to chair this session today.
Yep, thanks, Petra. Bonjour, hello everyone. Welcome to our roundtable. Very excited for this one. I'm part of the Depot group. I'm on the coordinating committee. I'm also part of the two of the themes we do, the politics of deindustrialization and then the environment and deindustrialization. So it's the latter one that's brought me here today. And I'm really excited to hear our speakers. So our plan for today is we'll do groups of two as we go forward. So I'll introduce the first two speakers and then they'll do their presentations. Then we'll do two more, etc. And then after we're finished, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And I'll do my best to recognize everyone as we go. So, all right, so let's get started. Our first two speakers today are Jeff Manuel and Robert Suits. Jeff is a professor in the history department at the University of Southern Illinois, Edwardsville, and he's the author of Taconite Dreams: The Struggle to Sustain Mining on Minnesota's Iron Range, 1915 to 2000. And he is in Calgary as a Fulbright Canada Research Chair this year. He's working on a manuscript tentatively titled The Perennial Alternative: The History of Biofuels in the US and Brazil and Lessons for a Renewable Future. And then with him is Robert Suits. Robert is the Fennell Early Career Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. He previously worked as a postdoc associate at the University of Calgary. So I've got a strong Calgary connection today. After earning his PhD at the University of Chicago, his work investigates the historical connections between the environment and labor. So Jeff, we'll get you started. Go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, thanks so much, Greg, and thank you, Petra. Good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. It's still quite early in the morning here in Calgary, where I am. So it's great to be here, and let me share my screen. And is everyone able to see that? Awesome. Okay. So what I'd like to do is just kind of ease us into today's conversation by thinking broadly about some what I'm calling perspectives on environment and technology when we think about this broad topic of energy transitions and deindustrialization. So let me start off with just a really brief summary that Greg gave the brief introduction, but to kind of explain my own process to get here. And I began studying deindustrialization as actually an undergraduate student when I went to Youngstown, Ohio to do research in the early 2000s. I had the good fortune to run into Stephen High there and met with him when he was, I believe, wrapping up research for what became his first book, Industrial Sunset. And that really got me excited and interested in this just, obviously very, very crucial topic to think about. I then went on after some years of flitting around but did go to grad school and then wrote a study about deindustrialization in the Lake Superior mining district. That became my first book, Taconite Dreams. Now, my work since then has focused really on kind of two paths. The first is local public history, and the image you see there is a digital archive and online encyclopedia that I've edited for several years for Madison County, Illinois, as part of my job at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, and also working on energy history, which is the book I'm working on in the history of biofuels. And I want to talk about sort of some lessons from each of those two parts of my work. So I think one thing that has really stood out to me is in this work is thinking about consequences of deindustrialization when we think about energy and energy transitions, to think about the sort of consequences beyond human workers. Obviously, the human consequences of deindustrialization are really front and center, as they should be. But there's some, I think when we also think beyond that, there's some interesting lessons to learn. And one of these that stood out to me is the question of coal mining subsidence. I've run into this in the local history work. Madison County, Illinois is in southwestern Illinois. It was a large coal mining district, but with underground coal mines. Most of those mines, however, closed in the 1930s and 1940s. I believe the last one closed in the 1950s. The area had a several decade-long transition from its kind of industrial, heavy industrial mining role to becoming a bedroom community of St. Louis, with some of those former coal mining communities actually turning into quite affluent suburbs filled with, suburban homes and even McMansions and things like that. But very interestingly, I've been struck by how much the legacy of that underground room and pillar coal mining is still felt through this ongoing slow motion subsidence problems. And basically, if you're not familiar with it, subsidence is the fact that, like, at some point, the hollowed out underground area collapses and it sort of sinks into the ground. So you can see a photo here of a large, nice suburban home that in the area that has actually the foundation itself has buckled because it's sunk into the ground, basically. I've run into this in several oral history interviews. Here's an example from an oral history interview I did back in 2017 with a man named Robert Gibson, who is an expert in dealing with this subsidence. And he talks about his job is to basically be the emergency person when an old coal mine sinks into when the ground above sinks because of the coal mine subsidence. He sort of rushes over and deals with it. And it's not, catastrophic damage, thankfully, but it is alarming, like he said, right? This house dropped 3.5 feet across its length that night. So I just take it as an interesting story about the long tail of consequence of the transition, even in a very affluent region or somewhat affluent region that's sort of transitioned away from coal, is still very much dealing with these consequences and will be for several thousands of years. The other example I want to give is from my work on biofuels. And one of the big themes from this work is the transition from horse to automobile, tractor, internal combustion engines. That transition in the first half of the 20th century, I think, is really a crucial part of this story. And as Robert, who's going to go next, has shown, and scholars like Anne Norton Green and Joel Tarr, steam-powered industry of the 19th century actually dramatically increased the need for horses and mules. They were part of that energy system. But over the first half of the 20th century, the adoption of internal combustion engines, automobiles, and tractors in agriculture puts a lot of draft horses and mules out of work, so to speak. So I thought this is sort of interesting. It's not exactly the same thing as other deindustrialization studies, but it's an interesting thought experiment that what can we learn from thinking about these sort of now obsolete equine industrial workers and what happens to them after they are no longer needed as sort of machines of industrial production, if you will. And they say a picture says 1,000 words, and here's one picture from Western Canada of a woman working in a horse meat plant in Swift Current, Saskatchewan. And that's a sort of extreme example. But what I've been struck by is actually the differences in how these horses were treated after the adoption of tractors and internal combustion engines. In Eastern Canada and in the Eastern United States, where there often were smaller farms that had mixed grains, a couple different things going on, one of the most common outcomes was that the horse was sort of lived out its days, not being used for farm production as much anymore, but also not sent to the slaughterhouse. Oftentimes farmers had formed emotional bonds of one kind or another with their horses, and they never replaced the horse when it died, but they also didn't send it to the slaughterhouse or the glue factory. Now in Western Canada and the Western United States, they were much less sentimental. Again, this is a broad generalization, but it struck me because I was here in Canada doing research and found during the 1940s, Western Canada actually created the I forget the exact title here, the Western Horse Marketing Cooperative, that was basically set up to buy up all these now obsolete draft horses, slaughter them, and turn them into canned horse meat that was sent mostly to Europe to alleviate the food shortages after World War II. And so I just take it as an interesting example of how important the context is. I think especially the context under which industrialization happens comes to shape the consequences for workers after deindustrialization. Of course, horses are different than people in all kinds of ways, but I think it is sort of a telling example that in the Western agricultural regions, which always had been kind of bonanza wheat farms and had almost like a shock agricultural industrialization, they're also completely unsentimental. Of the minute those horse workers are not useful for them, they send them right to the curb or to the slaughterhouse. Whereas there's other contexts where in the East where industrialization happened differently. And the last thing I'll say here, and thinking broadly about this, is just that I think it's helpful to maybe think a little more carefully about this term energy transitions within deindustrialization studies. And I would maybe, as a provocation, just say, I think it might be helpful for us to distinguish between what we might think of as large scale energy transitions that are national or global in scope. This is much of the centers on our climate discourse. And then the smaller scale energy transitions where a particular coal mine shuts down, a particular farm gets rid of its horses or things like that, and where our existing literature on deindustrialization and job loss and factory closures proves most helpful to us. And I think I've hit my 8 minutes, so I will wrap up now. And thanks everybody. I look forward to hearing any questions you have.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. So Robert will be coming up next. Give him a second to get his slides going for us.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. Hope I click the right window. All right, great. Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And thanks also to Jeff for teeing me up just perfectly with reference to the horses. Yeah, so I'd like to use my time here to share some brief thoughts and hypotheses about how energy might shift how we think about deindustrialization, and particularly the relationship of energy transitions to the lived experience of deindustrialization. This is going to be based a bit on two kind of different branches of my work. I work a lot with quantitative kind of studies of energy over time, but then I'm also looking at kind of the archival evidence of workers' lived experience with energy transitions. So this is all very new and in progress. Some of it's a little out there, so I'd love to stress test this in the Q&A. So please feel free to push back. I'm going to use these Sankey diagrams that I produced back in 2019 as part of an interdisciplinary team. A quick primer for these if you haven't seen them before. Various forms of energy are on the left. I'm gesturing how I see them on the screen, so I have no idea if my hand is in the right place in your screens. But forms of energy are on the left, like natural gas and coal. End uses are on the right, stuff like residential, commercial, industrial, etc. There's one intermediate box, electricity. And the lines between them are scaled according to the amount of a given kind of energy going to a given use in a given year. So together, one of these diagrams shows the uses of energy across the American economy at a specific point in time. So my first hypothesis today is very simple. It's just that deindustrialization represents a realignment of the relationship of labor to energy. So most of my archival research looks at how the relationships of labor to the environment have changed over time, and energy is one of the chief drivers of that change. In my current book project, I argue that the energy transition from coal to oil in the 20th century that Jeff was referencing fundamentally reorders labor, not just of horses, but of humans, as the miniaturization of fossil power from the internal combustion engine prompted the use of machine work where there was previously manual labor. This is particularly prominent in rural areas, but it's true throughout the economy. So just to show what this looks like over time, I have a few quantitative pictures of the economy here in 1875, and then in 1900, 1925, and 1950. And you can kind of see a evolution over time here, but what I'd like to draw your attention to, first of all, is that line to agriculture. And you can see, if you look in the agricultural box on the right, that the line going into it starts out mostly as biomass, which is horses and human labor. And as it goes on over time, this intensifies in this during the steam economy's kind of boom. Even as coal is increasing around it, you actually see a per person increase in the use of biomass power over time. And then it gradually collapses as you introduce petroleum into the equation and people start replacing horses with tractors. But the fossilization of the American economy also corresponds, I suggest, with the racialization of this kind of work. So in the steam age, manual laborers run the gamut of American demographics. You can see this in agriculture, you can see this in industry, you can see this in transportation. Manual labor is kind of this very representative sample of the American population. It's about 90% white, about 10% Black, a little bit of Latinx. But what happens with the fossilization of the American energy economy from roughly 1925 to 1950 is that manual labor, particularly in rural areas, becomes increasingly synonymous with a circumscribed, racially coded group of Latinx workers. Other industrial work instead becomes coded as white and increasingly bound up with ideas of petromasculinity. So images of overseers, of the prosperous working class, of petroleum-based machines, of masculinity and whiteness become increasingly entangled. And the working class thus segregates in the early 20th century in tandem with an energy transition. Deindustrialization is very much akin to this. It's synonymous with an energy transition that reshapes labor. So we can see if we go from 1950 to the present day, and here I'm going to draw your attention to the box going into, or the various lines going into industrial, which you can see in 1950, industry is already quite prominent, but it will change significantly over time as that coal band significantly shifts and becomes smaller, and all of the other bands going into it become significantly larger. And so this is talked about a little bit in the literature already. There's obviously the electrification and concomitant automation of factories, leading to job loss, even in factories that don't relocate. And there's a radical shift in the kinds of fuels that are being used. Some further research of mine, which I'm happy to get into, but don't have time for now, shows that this is both a product of what kinds of industries are still happening in the United States, but also what kind of fuels are going into it. And that this gradually shifts over time. But I'd like to go a bit further and suggest that, like it did in the early 20th century, this transition had a role in reshaping labor dynamics. So my second hypothesis is that the period of deindustrialization corresponds with an alienation of labor from energy, that people are increasingly distanced from energy, and that this may create some of the anomie that we see with the studies of deindustrialization that have become particularly prominent recently. I don't know, I'm running up on time, but I just want to talk about a third hypothesis and just a final hypothesis, which is to say that deindustrialization describes the per capita decline of industrial energy use that we see from roughly 1975 to the present in the United States. You can see a number over the box, 4,200, that gradually goes down. These are all per capita numbers. So per capita, Americans are using about 75% as much industrial energy as they did in 1975 today. But it also more broadly corresponds to declining energy intensity. And what I mean by this is that the energy intensity of the United States, the amount of energy needed to generate a single dollar of GDP, has been anomalously high for most of its history. But in recent years, the energy intensity has gone significantly down. That is, there is more economic productivity per unit of energy burned. And I argue that this is a major contribution that deindustrialization studies can make to the study of the economy more broadly, because it is describing the shift of an industrial economy to one associated with finance. And this is very clear in these energy diagrams, where you see not only the industrial bar gradually shrinking over time, but the commercial bar growing over time. And I think I'm going to cut it up there for today. And yeah, happy to talk about this more as we continue.
Okay, Sorry, checking the time. Very good. Thank you. Good. All right, we'll move on to our next group of two. So let me move that process here. We've got William Gillis, who is a history MA student and recipient of the Depot Master's Fellowship at Concordia. He grew up in the Cape Breton Island as it deindustrialized and moved to Calgary to find work, holding jobs in cartography, political organizing. He's a founding member for the award-winning Alberta Advantage podcast as well, which produces episodes on current political events and working class history. So he's returned, completed his degree at the University of Calgary, and his interests are in labor, regional economic development, fossil fuel capitalism, and state industrial policy. With him today is Chad Montrey. Chad is a professor in history at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. He's the author of 5 books, including The Myth of Silent Spring, Rethinking the Origins of American Environmentalism. He is a Fulbright Canada Research Chair this year at the University of Calgary, where he's investigating the role of Canadian workers played in making the environmental movement. He's also participating in the Energy and Society group at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. So we'll welcome both of them to our next round here. So William, you are up when you're ready.
Thank you, Greg. I'm just going to bring up my presentation here. Everyone can see that? Great. So my topic is about kind of energy transitions in Cape Breton and the coal industry there that kind of happen in a complicated, more complicated way than you would think. It's not particularly smooth. So for those of you going to the Depot conference in Cape Breton, this will be a little bit of a background of some of the history of coal mining and deindustrialization there. So in a nutshell, you had coal mining in Cape Breton from the middle of the 19th century, but by the 1930s, virtually all of the coal mining in the province of Nova Scotia is owned by the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation, or DOSCO. This employs, at its peak, about 10,000 people in the collieries and a nearby steel plant in the Sydney region, is in this map you can see here. But from 1945, this company has a lot of difficulty with its profitability. And so by 1967, the problem is so acute, the federal government nationalizes the Cape Breton, these mines under the Cape Breton Development Corporation, or DevCo, in order to sort of manage the closure and develop economic alternatives. And that's what I'm interested in for my master's. And so this DevCo eventually closes all the mines in the year 2001. So kind of the problem with what was happening here is you do have this energy transition. Obviously, oil is competing with coal in the post-war Canadian economy, but it's a little more complicated than that. You have in Cape Breton, it's far from its kind of major markets, which is Quebec and Ontario. The coal itself is expensive to mine for geological reasons primarily. These mines go out far underneath the sea. And the sort of response to this is the federal government subsidizes the production of coal. So you can actually see on the left here, this chart where the cost per ton of coal is like primarily covered by just federal subsidies. But the federal government is concerned because closure would, again, have enormous social impacts. So after kind of a lot of internal debate within the federal government in response to all these royal commissions and inquiries done in the 20 years between the end of the war and nationalization, that all determined that the industry is in crisis, and it's of course similar to the sort of overall structural crisis in the coal industry in the West. The federal government does nationalize it. So this was under Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, and probably one a very, very powerful cabinet minister within his government, Alan J. McCacken, who was a member of parliament for the area, who had a lot of influence on sort of ultimately saving the industry, even if nationalization was not their preferred outcome. So kind of one of the interesting things about this was obviously all these mines were very old and poorly mechanized. And the idea was that they were going to wind them down. But that's kind of not what happens. So there is this plan for phased closure, or initially it was 15 years, but they sort of abandoned this, that the closure will only happen when alternative economic development and jobs from that like replace coal mining jobs. But they're already committed to opening one new mine when they take over in 1967. But the 1973 oil crisis really improves the sort of prospects for coal. It gives it a new lease on life. And so by 1984, DevCo has closed the 4 mines that inherited it, but it's opened 4 new ones. And in fact, this is what you get. You get this sort of wind up and down, because you can see that the production here, they take over in 1967, so production of coal like goes down, and then you hit 1973, and then it shoots up again. In fact, it surpasses by 1980, by 1979, they've already surpassed what the production was in 1967 when they took over. And in fact, they've also like significantly increased the productivity per man shift, because they've hugely mechanized the production. So like these new mines are modern and efficient. They've hired thousands of new miners. And this production, this chart here cuts off in about 1980, but production continues to climb throughout the 1980s, and kind of peaks around 1990. However, DevCo was never profitable. It was never intended to be, because it was supposed to be a wind down. It's just a more efficient, sort of like, or less costly for the federal government than subsidizing a private company to lose money was the idea. DevCo also kind of largely abandons this alternative economic development plan that it has by the 1980s, and it really just focuses on its coal division. But kind of by the 1990s, you get low global prices, as well as like neoliberal governments federally and provincially that sort of combine to close down DevCo, with, of course, the resulting job losses and like social impacts in Cape Breton. So you have this kind of interesting story about like this idea of a just transition. You have this Canadian state that's active in managing this, or interested in managing the social impacts resulting from this energy transition from coal to oil. But the transition, it's not a smooth transition, because it isn't like a managed or phased wind down. You have this huge wind up of production before then another kind of wind down. And it kind of, I think, complicates a bit this idea of transition being a sort of inevitability, because there's a lot of political decisions that are made about coal mining here, that the government does decide to expand production rather than close it down. I mean, obviously, the environment in this context isn't really being thought about that much, but I think it's and it's also like this very interesting example of like state ownership and state management of industrial decline that you don't necessarily quite see elsewhere. Certainly not in North America, but even in Europe, where you do have a lot of state ownership in the coal sector, that wasn't usually brought in as like with the intent of doing managed wind downs. It was usually brought in to rationalize an industry that was still seen as having a future in usually right after World War II. But in this case, it is a government thinking about doing a kind of just transition, but then a lot of other things happen and decisions are made, which I haven't fully researched yet as to figure out why a lot of this happens. But I think there's some interesting parallels to now, particularly around how the Canadian federal government has nationalized a pipeline to deal with some of the crises in Canada's oil industry and the issues around around a just transition to close down this potential industry, because of the environmental concerns of continuing to burn fossil fuels. But I think to an extent, we should look at the history of this happening before in Canada. That might provide some ideas or predictions or even lessons, dare I say, about what we could do. So I think that's my 8 minutes.
Yes. Okay, good. Thanks, William. Very good. All right, we'll give Chad a second to get his slides up and running for us.
Hello to everybody. I actually only had like one slide. I think I'm just going to forego that and just wing it here.
Okay.
As Greg mentioned, what I'm doing right now, since I've come to Calgary, is looking at the role that workers played in making an environmental movement in Canada, and that has included a lot of focus on what's going on in Alberta, the province where Calgary is. And I can talk more about that research later if it comes up in Q&A. But what I want to do with the 8 minutes I got here is to go back to the first thing I ever did when I was in grad school. Greg and I were in grad school together, actually. And that became my first book, which was a study of surface coal mining in Appalachia. And this will, I think, be a nice bridge between William and Amber and Anna, who will be coming up next. But the study eventually became a book called To Save the Land and People. And the main thing that I was trying to do there was explain the origins or the rise and then the decline of a movement to stop coal mining, stop strip mining in the United States. Basically, initially at the state level in different parts of Appalachia, and then the federal level, activists were trying to get legislation to abolish surface coal mining. And I start the book by talking about coal mining as a way that industrialization came to the countryside. I mean, we often think of industrialization as an urban phenomenon, but it's going on also outside of the cities. And it brought this brought a lot of changes to the people of the region in terms of their work and in terms of the experience they have with the landscape around them. And that's even more true when coal mining started to evolve from deep mining to surface mining methods after World War II. And I saw that shift, or I try to sort of frame that shift as part of a longer history of mechanization. This is basically when coal operators start moving to strip mining methods, what they're trying to do is substitute machinery and also make work even more routinized to make the extraction of coal more profitable, right? So that's not really deindustrialization in my mind so much as more industrialization, even though it causes job loss. And I know that we often think of deindustrialization as being sort of paired with job loss, but in this case, the change that's going on in the coal industry is really making the labor of coal more industrial, and the way that coal was being extracted more industrial. And the deep miners in Appalachia understood what was going on quite well. They were experiencing the job loss themselves personally. They also understood how that together, as a thing that's happening to many people across the region, that was going to affect the local and regional economy. And Appalachia really had already a lot of trouble anyway, so this wasn't going to do much to make things any better. And they're also pretty aware of the environmental impact that surface mining was going to have and did have, because they're living there. They're seeing the deforestation, they're seeing soil erosion, they're seeing landslides because of the kind of strip mining that's being done in Appalachia. Acid mine drainage, which is polluting the waterways, including people's wells. And they decided, the deep miners decided to join up with others in the 1960s to stop strip mining. And this is maybe counterintuitive to the way people think the story would play out, but deep miners, those who belong to the United Mine Workers, were aligned with many of the grassroots activists that are trying to abolish surface mining. One of the groups that they established in the 1960s was called the Appalachian Group to Save the Land and People, which is where the title of my book comes from. And that was established in the summer of 1965 in Eastern Kentucky. And over the course of the rest of the decade, partly with that group and others sort of leading the way, they became more and more militant in the kind of protests that they were doing. So initially in the 1950s and early 60s, they're mostly doing petitioning and lobbying, trying to get the governor or state legislators in their state, in whatever part of Appalachia they're in, to do something to address the problems that strip mining was causing. But then they started doing nonviolent civil disobedience. They started standing in the way of bulldozers, haul trucks, and That escalated by the end of the late 1960s with some people doing industrial sabotage. This was probably deep miners because they know how to use explosives. So they would go up onto surface mine sites and start blowing up mine machinery, sometimes costing millions of dollars in damage. And they never harmed anyone, but they did have an impact in terms of registering the way in which the local residents in Appalachia were not in favor of strip mining. And so people in power began, just as I think people in power in during the Black Civil Rights Movement, they're seeing the protests that are taking place. They want to do something to stop those protests. The same thing happened in the case of strip mining. Members of Congress become more interested in passing some kind of regulatory legislation, and eventually, as the protests escalated, they're willing to abolish strip mining, and they get increasing numbers of people signing on to a bill by the early 70s that would have ended strip mining. I think you could see what's going on here as residents in Appalachia trying to shape industrial change in their interest, right? They're doing what they can to get something like a just transition, even though they don't use that term. That term isn't yet around. And it's one in which I think just transition is sort of broadly defined, right? They're not just talking about dealing with job loss for particular workers, but what happens to a whole community, right? What should an entire community or a region have in return for the kind of industrial change that they're going through? And it's mine workers together working with others in activist groups that are attempting to do this, right? But in the end, they failed. The book is a story of failure. Surface mining surpassed deep mining by the early 1970s in terms of the amount of coal that was being extracted. And then Congress passed some legislation that was supposed to regulate strip mining in 1977. But the law is basically based on a bill that the coal industry had started writing in the middle of the 70s, right? And so the law, which is called SMACRA, or people refer to it as SMACRA, that effectively legalized destruction that was going on, and it didn't do a whole lot to control the damage. And so meanwhile, what happened is technology evolved, and the strip mining that was going on in Appalachia turned into what we call mountaintop removal, where they just take off the entire top of a mountain, dump it in a valley, get the coal out. And yet still there's a decline in coal mining in Appalachia. The other thing that's going on is there's a shift of strip mining out west, mostly to the Powder River Basin in Wyoming and elsewhere. And what that does is leave a lot of job loss, environmental devastation, outmigration in Appalachia, right? That's what the region gets as a result of this industrial change. So there's a lot more to this story, I think, but I think it's an example I can sort of add to the conversation we're having here in terms of the roundtable of how changes in energy, or what we use and how we get it, are overlapping social and economic and political change. And that I think also raises some questions about how energy transitions and deindustrialization are or are not aligned. So I'll end it there and turn it over to the next group.
Okay, good. Thanks, Chad, very much. Good job winging it. All right, we've got our last two presenters coming up together here, so we'll give them some time to get ready. We have Amber Ward. Amber is a third-year PhD student in modern history at the University of St. Andrews, and her thesis studies how coal-field deindustrialization in Fifes intersected with broader changes in culture, mentalities, and social life. And her project uses oral history to consider a wide range of perspectives, including those from ethno-linguistic, gendered, and LGBTQ+ communities. And then last is Anna Bettini. Gab, are you doing Anna's? Is Anna here? I couldn't remember. You are doing it for her? Okay. Yeah. Okay, I'll give Anna's bio anyway, but Gab is going to do her presentation. Unfortunately, she couldn't join us today. But Anna is a postdoc research associate at the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. She's originally from Italy, and she's an environmental sociocultural anthropologist. And her work includes human environment relationships in energy landscapes, deindustrialization processes in oil and gas communities, and also environment and energy justice as well. And she is now working on a multi-sited comparative study between Canada and New Zealand that focuses on oil and gas sector changes in both of these geographic regions. Wow. So we've got two great presentations to finish up today. So Amber, we'll let you get started here when you're ready.
Thanks very much. Let me just share my screen. Everyone can see that? Great. So thanks for having me, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk to you a bit about my PhD research. It's very much rooted in the deindustrialization academic tradition. It's a historical study of a set of ex-industrial communities in Fife, in Scotland, and the main investigative tool is oral history interviews. I conducted these interviews last year with a range of community groups in the area, and I asked them the question, how do you feel that things have changed over recent decades? The method was my attempt at a Marxist feminist approach to deindustrialization. I conducted this research in sites of care, community groups, as opposed to sites of production, workplaces, which is more traditional. And I let the discussion meander freely rather than asking any questions of my own, see what would come out basically. And something that cropped up fairly often during these discussions linked to changes in the energy sector. And I felt that their testimonies shed so much light upon those aspects of an energy transition that aren't immediately obvious in the abstract, but are very real in the lives, homes, and emotions of the communities and people affected. So to some quick historical context. Fife is a semi-rural county located between Dundee in the north and Edinburgh, the capital city, in the south. The part of Fife that I'm interested in, the central region, was subject to late, rapid and highly concentrated coal industrialisation at the turn of the 20th century. And here are a few photos from one colliery in the area at this time. Coal was nationalised in the 1940s when it provided many well-paid, stable and somewhat safer jobs in new mines like these. When coal mines closed down throughout the post-war years, redundant miners were offered employment in an alternative sector, such as assembly line work. However, the neoliberal Thatcher premiership in the 1980s abandoned these moral customs, with many miners and factory workers in the area simply left redundant en masse. And since the 1980s, poverty and unemployment in central Fife have tragically skyrocketed. On one hand, the area appears to have followed the typical economic trajectory of the Scottish or British ex-mining community: industrial boom, post-war stability, and then neoliberal decimation and decline. But it was also unique in that Hosepot was once Scotland's largest and chief port for coal exports, Methil Docks. In the early 1900s, millions of tons of coal from across Scotland was shipped out from this port to the rest of the world. So there was a huge amount of export infrastructure here. In the early 1970s, Britain and many other nations transitioned away from reliance upon coal as its primary source of energy and towards oil. A major part of this transition in Scotland was the exploitation of domestic offshore oil fields in the North Sea. And so at this time, the more or less deserted docks at Methil were transformed into a major facility for the construction of oil production platforms, which were then, like coal once was, shipped off into the North Sea and across the world. And so now onto some testimonies from the community groups themselves. And we'll start with a conversation I had with a group of retired women from Methil, which is where the docks are. Audrey recalled that after miners in the area were made redundant in the 1970s and 1980s, that there were indeed new jobs that arrived in the area, but that these jobs were never given out to anyone here. They were given to men from large, generally wealthier areas such as Edinburgh, the capital city, and Glenrothes, the large post-war new town, and the group agreed with this. Another member of the group, May, went on to explain that these jobs, these new jobs, these were in the oil industry, but that it had been deemed that there were apparently not the skills here. No one in the area had been offered an apprenticeship. So these women actually saw new workers commuting in every day to their community to work in oil, whilst the men in their own families working in coal mines suffered redundancy. The women themselves gave the solution we need for any future just transition. Workers from the old energy sector should not be made redundant, but where possible, retrained to work in the new energy sector. Lynn made the point that employers could have done both. They could have brought in the expertise to train local people rather than bussing it in. Audrey said that she felt that it was at this point, when she started to see the main thoroughfare in the community littered with the cars of the new oil workers commuting in every day, that for her marked the onset of the downfall of the community where she lived. And so were this to be achieved, the retrainers of energy workers involved, the women tell us exactly why a future energy transition cannot be left to the markets. It must be managed and manoeuvred by the state for the good of the public and the good of the community. The women recalled other injustices imposed on their community. These were not exclusively just linked to employment and redundancy in themselves, but to who exactly was offered these jobs and the power structures that these reinforced within their family homes. Jane reflected on the big employers in the area in the coal and oil industries, which have come and gone over the 20th century. She recalled that the apprenticeships, when they were offered, were only ever given out to the loddies, the young boys, which resulted in employment only for men who would go on to be the breadwinners in families and enjoy all of the power which came with this position of dominance. And what Jane tells us is that regardless of whether or not energy is nationalised, coal was and oil wasn't, officials have to think about who they give these new jobs to, and the social structures such offerings either reinforce or subvert. From Jane's memories, we can see exactly why a just transition must not only be green, but also feminist too. It must subvert patriarchal norms by offering employment to people of all genders and none, and incorporating adequate provision for childcare at the same time. And finally, another conversation I had with the local Polish club revealed much about how the move away from national reliance upon coal was felt in the mining community where one of the members grew up. John recalled that after the colliery closed in the 1980s, residents in the surrounding houses were evacuated by the local council, told to find new housing, and the slag heap poured over their empty homes and the beautiful beachfront at Dysart. From John, we learned the importance for a future transition of always making changes in consultation with local people and of protecting existing communities and their surrounding environment and natural space. And so if I can offer some quick concluding points. I feel that these interview testimonies reveal so much about how an energy transition can actually be felt and experienced when so often we talk about it in very abstract or national and global terms. We learned that a transition to green energy is not just about how a society acquires its light and its heat, but it's about the social and economic infrastructure, jobs, municipal services, and childcare provision, which is built at the same time. Our demands for a net zero economy for green energy must therefore be made in union with our demands for community justice in deindustrialized areas. And so I hope that this Marxist feminist approach to deindustrialization studies can also offer insights into what a Marxist feminist energy transition might look like in the future. This transition must not only be green, but also red, socialist, and feminist and anti-imperialist too, prioritising the centering and valuing of gender equality, racial equality, and care work. So that's me just at 8 minutes now. Thank you so much. Look forward to the next speakers.
All right, great. Thank you, Amber. All right, Anna's presentation, Gabrielle, you're going to do that for us. So we'll get her set up and whenever you're ready.
Okay. So Anna is here today, but she's just listening in. We're going to be recording questions for her about her presentation. So if you have anything, please put it in the chat and she'll get back to you later. But for now, here's the video. I'm going to start playing it and hopefully we'll all be able to hear Anna's sound. So please shoot me a thumbs up if that's the case.
Okay, so in my short presentation today, I will discuss some reactions and steps regarding just transition strategies in New Zealand. I will draw from my experience from my previous doctoral research in the region of Taranaki, which is considered the center of oil and gas in the country. And I will argue how, despite previous efforts that have been made regarding energy transition strategies, more dialogue is necessary between the diverse groups responsible for promoting, supporting, and encouraging this transition. and those that will be mostly impacted by the transition itself. A lack of dialogue and consultation can create lack of information for the general public, which can ultimately damage how communities perceive and receive these changes, whether they accept them or not. So when we discuss energy transition in New Zealand, the country is a step ahead in transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy consumption. And New Zealand's primary energy supply currently comes significantly from renewable resources, providing most of the country's electricity. Approximately 40% of the primary energy is generated through geothermal, hydro, wind, and bioenergy. However, the remaining 60% comes from oil, natural gas, and a small amount from coal. Strategies around a just transition have only recently developed within the last 5 years. A series of steps and government decisions have caused opposing reaction, especially in the region of Taranaki. Here, both onshore and offshore oil and natural gas extraction have been steadily occurring since the early 1960s, with first the discovery of the onshore Kapuni fields, and later in 1969, the offshore Maui fields. Different techniques, exploration processes, and policies have all contributed to support the sector growth. So until 2017, the government led by the Conservative National Party had prioritized the expansion of the oil and gas industry. However, with the election of the Labour coalition government led by Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, things have changed. As a first step in 2018, Aotearoa New Zealand Parliament passed the Crown Minerals Petroleum Act amendment, banning future offshore oil and gas exploration. This decision was taken without consultation with the oil and gas industry, and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern justified it by declaring that it was a choice that ought to be made to protect future generations from climate change. Therefore, no consultation needed. As the ban was passed into a law 1 week before the second phase of my doctoral fieldwork, the topic became recurrent in my conversation with community members and experts, eager to share their views on this decision. Words indicating a loss in economic growth, a loss in social and cultural aspects tied to the oil and gas industry were often part of this discourse, inferring how the legislation would bring more negative resolutions than positive ones to the region. However, it was the lack of consultation that created a deep anger and frustrations in the oil and gas industry. Representatives from Energy Resources Aotearoa, which is formerly the Petroleum Exploration Production Association of New Zealand, PPENS, an incorporated society supporting the oil and gas sector, raised their discontent and concerns about the macroeconomic and regional economic impacts the government's decision would bring to those employed in the sector. In Taranaki, the oil and gas industry employs around 1,500 people, and it generates over 11,000 jobs nationwide. So uncertainty, frustrations, and lack of clarity were all common feelings and worries shared with me from local government representatives to those employed as engineers or at the managerial level in the oil and gas industry. As I approached those directly working on oil and drilling rigs, many seemed not to worry about it, completely unaware of the changes occurring, indicating how it would never stop the need for extraction of hydrocarbons in the country. It has been very challenging for some of them to imagine reinventing oneself in a new position in a different sector. So in light of the lack of consultations and to better support steps toward an energy transition, between February and April 2019, Venture Taranaki, which is a regional development agency, organized a series of local workshops and public consultation to gather different voices on what the future of Taranaki will look like through the creation of the Taranaki Roadmap to 2050, covering different topics from food, tourism, and of course, energy. The New Zealand government funded the project through the Just Transition Unit within the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. At the beginning phase of the Just Transition process, I had the chance to interview and converse with representatives of the Just Transition Unit, who all asserted with me their difficulties in creating an equitable consultation, especially in terms of involving as many community members, Maori, Iwi, and APU representatives in discussing the energy transition. Venture Taranaki reported that more than 700 people across the region signed and participated to discuss the various topics related to the just transition. 700 people, which represents less than 1% of the overall population in the region. So I took part in the workshops as part of the energy group section of the Taranaki 2050 roadmap to understand how just transition was presented and the range of participants involved in this process. As it turned out, the range included mainly business owners, entrepreneurs, individuals interested in the energy sector. So there was a lack of community members' involvement, a lack of conversation between groups with diverse opinions and backgrounds, despite the workshops had been created to incorporate elements of distribution justice. Instead, it appeared to me, and later on as other interviewees confirmed, that this was a very discretionary process, and several of the community members or those involved in environmental organizations explained to me that there was a general sense of discouragement in participating. Although the discussion on the strategy started in 2018, the implementation process is still in its early stages. To help develop and scale renewable energy investments, a Center for Future Energy Development, Araake, was established in 2020, and there's been discussion on offshore wind development and wind to hydrogen and green ammonia project. However, it's still uncertain whether local and regional organizations are resourced well enough to implement their ambitious plans. The government's commitment to phasing out oil and gas so far only pertains to the offshore oil and gas industry. Onshore oil and gas production represents still around 2/3 of the industry and continues to be supported actively. A more important point to be made is in regards to those working in the oil and gas industry. There's been discussion with labor unions on specific supports for workers, such as career training programs into renewable energy sector. However, lots of skepticism surrounds the security of these jobs, how secure these jobs will be. And so far, the only plan that has been initiated regarding workers has been the design of a social unemployment insurance scheme that would support workers to retain about 80% of their income after losing their jobs. However, there's been already delays on this scheme, and because Taranaki has yet to go through any substantial employment losses in the energy sector, it's still uncertain how these aspects of the transition will be managed. To conclude, the lack of consultation is still an important issue that needs to be addressed in making the just transition as equitable as possible, and to make actively also aware the general public of the changes occurring. Their input is very necessary. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks, Anna. I know you're out there. And Gab, thanks for playing that for us. Sounds good. All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for just a great set of presentations this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. We've got just about an hour now, I think, Petra, right, for some Q&A. So
well, I have another 8 minutes, sorry.
Oh, I forgot. I'm sorry. I didn't mean, I'm looking over here at what we've got left. Yes. So Petra's going to wind things up for us. So almost an hour for Q&A. Sorry. So hang on. Go ahead. You're up.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. So I would just want to use my 8 minutes, not so much to talk about specific research that I do, but sort of after listening to all these papers, but also influenced by our discussions that we have had here in Calgary, first with our postdocs and now also with our Fulbrighters. I want to talk a bit about that. But I do want to quickly take the opportunity to also mention that we here in Calgary join you from the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 region and Southern Alberta. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So first of all, when we started thinking about this roundtable, one of the things that was really important for us is to realize that coal is actually at the center of many deindustrialization studies. And that is for us something that is important. Of course, often it's because it's also connected to steel industry, another industry that is often studied in deindustrialization studies. But it is something where we felt that why haven't more energy historians also be involved in that discussion when a lot of times the industry that is really at the focus of this is the coal industry. And I think what we already realize is when we look at these studies is that they often focus on labor and the coal mine as the workplace. Sometimes they look to coal as a way of life. And this is why we have seen with the work that Amber, for example, shows is there are ways to look at it in different ways. So one of the things that energy historians would bring to some of these discussions is that we go beyond unionized labor in a very specific workplace, which is the mine, and maybe sometimes connected to the mine. Because what we are able to do is we can look at these kind of industries as just a particular part of a larger energy system, or even an energy region, which some environmentalists then might call an energy sacrifice zone, for example, due to its environmental impacts, or what some have called coalscapes. Why would this be an advantage? It is an advantage because it allows us to bring in not just the production of energy, but also the consumption, for example, of energy. Any energy region is never just defined through its particular consumption, through its labor relations, but every worker is also an energy consumer. And so a perspective that broadens the analysis to include that gives us slightly different insights. I have shown this kind of what a broader conception of energy systems can do for the cases of women. So what this does is it brings in women in two ways. The one way is that we understand that any energy system is not just based on unionized labor of miners working in the mines, but also the women who stay at home and actually enable their husbands being able to do this kind of work. Because coal mining down in the mines means that men are away for more than just the hours that they work in the mine. There's a lot of time getting into it. So it's really left to the women to ensure that everything around it works. And secondly, women themselves, in a larger understanding of an energy system, are consumers. And it creates ambivalences. So for example, where women in West Germany after 1950 want certain gadgets or want more electricity or want certain things in their household, which actually indirectly undermines the work of their husbands because they change from, very dirty sort of coal-fueled heating to cleaner heating, which is not based on coal. And that's something that we can do through bringing in sort of energy history into this. But we have different energy systems than coal, and both Anna and Amber mentioned this, and that's oil. And it's interesting how we don't have that many studies on deindustrialization and oil. You might say that has to do with the fact that oil is still the prominent prominent fuel, but I think it's also because it's a lot more decentralized. There aren't these kind of company towns. You don't have necessarily this way of life, although coming from Alberta, I can tell you it is identity building. So there are some questions around how significant is the coal part of the story, and we've seen this today with the many coal stories. The second point I very quickly want to make is energy has been fueling industrialization. So I think it's important that we bring together energy and questions of growth. If energy is sort of so instrumental to industrialization, what role does energy then play in de-industrialization? How does capitalism, neoliberalism, and all these kind of things come in? And as the presentations by Chet and Jeff, but also Robert shows, there's a very clear connection between energy and labor and what constitutes an energy industry. But very often in deindustrialization studies, we focus on what's called the mineral versus the organic regime. So fossil fuels, and not on manual labor, horse labor. So there is a lot still to be done there. And the last point, since it's sort of the 8 minutes and I'm getting close to it there, is of course around the topic and theme of energy transition. Now, Jeff mentioned, maybe we should differentiate between large and small scale energy transitions, or what we call single fuel energy transitions. So for example, just from coal to oil, as opposed to this massive shift from an organic regime to a mineral regime. Or we need to understand what is the global and the local dimension of these kind of energy transitions. But there's also actually a national level. So there's a politics around energy transition, which take on very often very specific national dimensions. And I know Hugh Gibbs, who's also spoken to us here in this area, is specifically interested in how this does not transnationalize, that while specific workers are undergoing very similar effects of energy transition, they are not necessarily pursuing a transnational solidarity. So there are specific politics involved into this. And this brings me, I think, to the two main other points that I would like to make. The one is, when we use energy transition to contribute to discussions on deindustrialization, we need to be very clear whether we talk about a source concept or an analytical concept. So do we use energy transition to revisit specific developments in the past that may not have been called energy transitions, but that we can see are in one way or another energy transitions because we move from one to another? Or is it really something that is used as a term in itself to discuss certain developments, such as in the 1970s? And that is a very important differentiation, because you could make the argument that there's a very normative underbelly around energy transition already starting in the 1970s, when it really is introduced to kind of stay away from the energy crisis, which is a lot more threatening. And this is important because, as we have seen from discussion that Amber provides, it also brings us into the sort of normative dimension of the energy justice discussion. Is it green? Is it red? What should it be? And we have a lot of historical case studies that really help us understand this, but also always bring it back to that labor component there. And this is where lived experience and stories that everyone have contributed here are really important, because it allows us to tell different stories. But the argument I think that we as a group would also want to make is that if we bring in energy history and insights from energy history into energy transitions, it does help us to tell different stories about deindustrialization. It might even question our definitions at times of what we consider deindustrialization, because it kind of introduces an endpoint, which energy transition does not. And why is this important? And this is my very last point, is, as Amber has shown, in the UK, deindustrialization really conveys this endpoint, because this is, Thatcher comes in, there's an end to certain working class politics. But if we then kind of revisit that discussion from an energy transition point, we see many more nuances, complexities, and it really allows us, though, to bring in groups that are not always prominent or at the center, although increasingly they do become more studied, such as women, racialized, non-unionized labor, and others. So I'm really looking forward to the questions. I thank everyone who presented today, and I hope you've seen that there's a lot that can be done by bringing and connecting energy history and deindustrialization studies. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Petra. Thanks again, everyone. Now I think we're done, right? So we've had our presentation. So now we've got some time for questions. So I'll do my best to see if I can see the hands. So try to raise your hand if you can using the emoji there, since we're not all on video, and then we'll try to go through those as best we can here. So I might ask Gab to help me, because she's running the show here if I can't see things. So please, who would like to open us up for questions or comments? Everything's set up here. Okay. All right, David, you're up. You're first. Thank you for getting us started. Appreciate it.
Hello, and good afternoon from Spain to all of you. I just wanted to ask Amber if she could explain a little bit more this transition, gender and feminist transition from the industrialization till now, because based on my own experience as a researcher of these issues here in North Spain, I would say, and I would like to discuss with you this issue, because in my opinion, as I have studied, the industrialization has a very gender dimension and was very negative to women for different reasons. No, first of all, they were fired before their husbands if they were working in the same factory, because it was like this mentality that if your husband already has a work you don't need. And secondly, most of these women, as I have studied, they kind of suffer like an erasure of their working class identity, and some of them became like more domestic women. So I would like to ask Amber and all of you who have studied these issues, what are your impressions about this process? Because I think it's quite interesting. So thank you all for your thought-provoking interventions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, David, for your question. I can jump in first of all. I think when I think about a feminist approach to understanding deindustrialization or energy transition, I think it's possibly about taking the center away, the focus away from just labor, which definitely in a UK context, when we look at what workers produced our energy, be it coal or oil, tend to be white men. And so a feminist perspective would look at how these transitions in labor, in energy production, affect communities as a whole, affect the kind of, as you were saying, Petra, those parts of society that are so often marginalized and neglected. And a big part of that too is looking at how when we transition from reliance on one form of energy to another, there's always a change in labor, so there's always a change in things like care work. And you know that social reproduction, domestic labor that's being done in the home. So I think that possibly, I definitely don't have a straightforward answer, but just trying to kind of widen up what you consider when you think about energy transition and deindustrialization, you know, more than labor, and into communities and homes. I think so that's probably, I guess. Or on you go, David.
If you don't mind, also, I wanted to share, maybe we should introduce this. For me, I think it's important to the difference between work, labor, and employment. Because most of the times, when there was the industrialization, women have less employment but more work, because they have to deal also with broken husbands and things like that. And no, so I don't know, maybe it was interesting also to establish that difference following the classic feminist distinction, no, of work, labor, and employment. Thank you all for your answer, and thank you, and Amber. I think we have things in common also in our research. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you.
Maybe I can also quickly add, since I mentioned women as well, and that's something that I looked at. It's exactly that question of paid, unpaid labor, and you know, we do know that women in this coal regions, in terms of their energetic, you know, calorie sort of balance, they use just as much, for example, cleaning their husbands' work clothes or these kind of things. There are these famous studies, I think in West Germany in early 1970, where they compared that. And that's exactly the reason why we want to kind of pull it away from unionized paid labor to any kind of work. And that I do sense that for energy historians, that's easier to think, because we look at these, you know, as Robert has done more quantitatively, we really look at these kind of balances in terms of, you know, energy, work, labor that is happening. And it's slightly easier, but it also facilitates and allows a very important and necessary feminist approach to this, that, you know, that part of work, because it's not paid, it's not happening in the traditional workplace, the mine, is often taking out of the equation.
Good. Okay. Thanks. We'll move on, I think, right? I don't think anyone else wanting to add in. Bryce, you were second, and then Sophia, you had something in the chat. We'll get to you after Bryce. So Bryce, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Bryce. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm from Fife actually. And I just want to say, fantastic work, Amber. I'm really pleased to see, I'm really delighted to see such amazing work you've done there. So I just wanted to say that. I'm actually being affected by the climate crisis, and I'm a climate justice activist. I'm also a Scottish Green Party trade union group equalities officer, and I've been personally impacted by the climate crisis in Fife, where Moss Morans, which is Scotland's third largest polluter, basically was polluting in the air of the community of Cowden Beef, and was really causing a lot of harmful impacts to basically the world around us. And one of the things I just want to maybe just chime in on the more of a feminist approach and about women in particular was what's really struck me to become more of an activist was that there are many mothers single mothers within the Fife community, and one of the things that came out for me, which was quite striking, was that I'm neurodiverse, I've got autism, and I was at a public meeting, at a Moss Moran Action Group meeting, and one of the things that came up was basically a single mother stood up quite bravely and courageously and said that their son had wet the bed out of fear and alarm and distress due to ExxonMobil and Shell's polluting of the plant, and there was other women there who basically stated similar stories, and also there was a woman who has got two neurodiverse girls who are non-verbal, and they were able to find out and able to use memes and arts and culture to try and communicate their visions of a more green and just world. And I just think that this really comes back to, if this really allowed me, and I want to say thank you so much to Amber for reminding us about that there are many people within working class communities in Fife who are mothers, who are caregivers, who basically do a lot in the background to support people who've been directly impacted or indirectly impacted by the climate and ecological crisis which we're facing. And I'm just wondering is that when we're trying to talk about a just transition, I know that Friends of Earth Scotland and Platform have released a new paper called Our Power, which I would recommend you all read. It's about trying to do a just transition. And I'm wondering how can we use this research, which is absolutely groundbreaking and amazing work, to help us in the climate justice community to communicate that accessibly and inclusively with an intersectional feminist approach to communities around the most impacted areas, and also to bring this in a more accessible format to allow climate justice activists to use the research to back up our activism within communities and community organising, and to try and be able to bring those stories in Fife as well to the forefront, and to actually show that this is a broad spectrum of people who have been affected and who have seen the industrialisation and of basically Scotland and across the UK and more widely in Canada now and other places. So I'm just wondering, what can we do to take this research to a new level? What can we do to try and be able to take this into action and to be able to really centre the stories of the women and caregiving people in this context? I think it's so important to try and be able to centre those individuals as we go along in our journey to basically smashing the patriarchy and really dismantling and divesting from fossil fuel industry and their addiction to the oil and gas. And that's why we should really be stopping like the Rosebank oil field in the north coast of Shetland. And that's something I'm quite would like to maybe recommend is please do have a look at Stop Rosebank and Stop Campbell campaign, because that's something which we're trying to absolutely go ahead and try and stop. So it's more of a broader question for everyone. How can we take all your research you've done and make it accessible, make it take it into climate action? And I just want to say thank you so much for listening to me. And I really just want to say I appreciate you all, and I just want to say I love you all for what you've all done. This is really amazing work, and this is groundbreaking. Thank you so much. And I'm actually moved by this all. I'm being moved to maybe tears of finally seeing, especially with Amber's presentation, about centering the views of that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Bryce, very much for that. Yeah, Amber, go ahead. I think it was directed mostly at your work, but if anybody else wants to jump in, please do.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Bryce. Thanks for sharing everything that you were saying, and thanks for your question. I think that talking about how do we make our research more accessible, I think that that's definitely for us in deindustrialization studies. I think it's kind of, I mean, I won't speak for us all, obviously, but I think that's kind of what brought a lot of us here in the first place, is this need to, it's a care or an anger, at least, for something that I think drives a lot of our research, and we want to bring justice to communities that we study, and we want to kind of break it out of the academy as much as possible. I think that definitely, I can only speak for kind of like Scottish academia, but we have a lot of scholars such as you and Gibbs, so you mentioned Petra, looking at kind of studying these types of things, looking at as you were mentioning, the oil plant in Mossmoran, Bryce, and that they are kind of working with a lot of activist communities as part of their research. You know, it's not just an adjunct or an add-on, it's kind of built in. And so I think I can possibly just sort of say more of that, working with activists and local communities as built into the research. But I think that as a lot, I hope a lot of you agree, and knowing some of you here, that's very much what drives a lot of our research, I think, is that desire to kind of break it out of the academy and do it for the communities themselves.
I just want to say thank you very much. Just want to quickly just say I would love to. I'm actually helping Film and Campaign Limited, which is did the oil machine documentary on BBC Scotland, and worked with Creative Scotland to do it. So it's a fantastic film. Please do watch it. It's a really good understanding of the context of oil and gas. I'd like to invite you, Amber, to be potentially on the panel of that, to maybe discuss and maybe to bring those stories you've curated and bring them to a panel. So I'd like to reach out to you later on, if possible, to actually be able to invite you onto a panel, which hopefully will be held in Cowdenbeath or Lochgelly soon, to try and be able to use your to be able to bring your stories to life and to help us. So I'd love to invite you onto the panel to really deliver that from an academic standpoint. So I'd love to support you in amplifying your incredible work you've done.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay. Gab, you want to focus on the chat, or I can if you want, either way.
I just had my hand up to read Sophia's question to make sure.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
So Sophia has a question for Robert about energy and labor transitions from biomass and the racialization he's observing. So Sophia is wondering if Robert is considering the scholarship on racial capitalism and how that scholarship might be historicizing the work that he is doing in the 20th century context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sophia. That's a really great literature to look at. And yeah, I have just started to think about this question of the racialization of the labor force across the 20th century. And absolutely, I'm hoping to integrate analysis of racial capitalism into it. I think what I find really compelling about this story, and I hope maybe adds something to the discussion, is it makes it really concrete how what is in like absolute terms a minority of the population is still a crucial nexus of exploitation for capitalism. And that's to say that, you know, these laborers may make up a literally a minority of the population, but since they're performing these kind of essential roles in manual labor, they have kind of an impact that's significantly beyond that. And it helps explain some of the ways in which this exploitation, their underpayment, and their kind of mistreatment have been justified through this kind of like division of labor that's in part, I guess the word might be reified by processes and cultures of petromasculinity. And I hope all of that made as much sense out loud as it did in my head. But yeah, these are still concepts I'm playing with. But yeah, thank you for that question.
Okay, thanks, Robert. Stephen, you're up. Go ahead, please.
Great.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all. That was just an incredible session, and certainly got me thinking a lot about, geography. I was thinking of Chad's point about the countryside, so shifting, our focus a little bit, away from towns necessarily to thinking about region and so on, thinking about scale. Like, I think a lot of the field has been very local. And so when you scale up, you see things you don't see otherwise, but then the danger of losing something in the process, right? And I think Amber's point is really, really important. I guess my question is around, like, I guess the concept of transition, right? Like I there's all kinds of transitions, right? So I'm thinking of like the 70s and 80s, then the transition to a global economy with the GATT and the integration of national economies. There's a transition there. Of course, here we're talking about energy transition. So I'm wondering about the concept of transition, like what it offers, and maybe like what we need to sort of worry about, I guess, with that idea. And how it might relate to other frameworks. I know a lot of people in the field talk about, like, the half-life of deindustrialization, right? Which is, I think, a different kind of framing, right, to it, or even like displacement, which suggests more violence, I guess. So I wonder if transition ties into sort of inevitability. It is there a danger of letting people off the hook for decisions they're making? Does it depoliticize in a sense of that's an inevitable thing, right? We just need to do it right. So I'd love to hear, and it gets back to the politics and maybe what Petra was saying around the difference between the concept and the term, right? And so I'd love to hear everyone or whoever wants to sort of respond to that jumble of ideas. So, yeah. But thank you so much. Wonderful. Yeah.
Okay, any one of our panelists want to go start with that? Oh, William, you're yes, go ahead. I see you now. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, speaking to the sort of politics of transition, or the way that transitions could be used to sort of depoliticize what's happening. I think that from the primary source material I've been reading through about DevCo, that was what was happening in the lead up to the nationalization, is that so much of the royal commissions and the inquiries that the federal government does, like, talk about the sort of collapse of the coal industry in any sort of like technocratic ways. Like, this is an issue of space. It's just the coal is expensive because it's just so far from its markets, and the transportation costs make it uncompetitive, or the sort of technical and geological problems with mining it, or just like this, that the industry it needs to mechanize more. Like, this is just sort of the issue. And then eventually, like, more discussion about, like, well, oil has replaced coal in a lot as a fuel in many different places. So it's talking about it as just something that's kind of naturally happening, and the federal government has to kind of intervene to sort of manage the social impacts of it, rather than thinking about rather than seeing like this transition as like sort of a political and social thing that's happening, that like that this is sort of like a result of like really uneven regional development within Canada. Like this is like only partly recognized at best. But yeah, there is a tendency for the sort of state to see this as to see this transition as like sort of just like inevitable and like apolitical. But then you get sort of responses from the local people who pressure the government to actually intervene. They, of course, see this like in a very different, tend to see it in a very different way, that like, no, this doesn't have to happen this way. Like we could, in many cases, it's like, oh, we could just keep the mines open forever. But in many cases, like that these sort of peripheral regions don't deserve to just like be left behind and abandoned. So they're making a more like obviously like political case for what's happening.
I would also add, and this, I mean, not surprisingly, words matter. And with our, very transnational project, we also have the issue of languages. And there are some very interesting nuances, as you already know, Stephen. Some of us have talked about this before, because, energy transition, in Germany, it's called Energiewende, which really is something like more of a turnaround, if you will, right? I mean, depending on how you translate Wende. Equally, though, we have this with deindustrialization, right? In the German context, we talk about Strukturwandel, structural change. So I do feel that, and I know we have started this as a group, but there's a lot more to be done around these ideas of, change, transition, transformation, turnaround, all these things, because I agree with William. They can take on very specific political meanings, and that's where it's really important to come back to the local, right, to on the ground, to the oral histories, because for some people they're extremely political, even though the terms may not have started as such. So I know, I mean, I'm more familiar with the energy transition side. Jean-Baptiste Fresseau, for example, argues, right, that the whole term energy transition is really brought in the 70s to do exactly what you're talking about, to depoliticize the discussions around energy crisis and scarcity and insecurity and these things, because, this would be, make it much more sort of, so it's a lot easier to kind of start a discussion around that. But then even, within Germany, so once we have Strukturwandel and then we have East Germany, and that is all discussed more under the whole label of transformation, because it's so connected to broader political transformations, right? This is why I do think it's so important for us to understand who is using this term for what purposes, but also to really historicize it. I think in our pre-discussions, we talked about the long-willed energy transition. The one thing I really want to bring into the discussion now is none of this discussion is new. We had long ago discussions around this, but the difference is, and that's where Chet's current work is really so important, that a lot of concepts around just transition and, combining labor and environmental concerns comes out of the working class movement. But now we are at the stage, particularly here in Alberta, but also in Europe, when you look at the way that specific initiatives about helping coal regions in the eastern parts of the EU, they took out that whole theme of just energy transition. They talk about transition in coal regions, and then in a different policy, they talk about just transition mechanisms. But they completely took out, if you look at it, that energy, that just energy transition. So I do think it's really important, because what we now see, and this is why it's so important for our project, what role has populism played to actually make it almost impossible to combine what Amber called, right, the green and the red? Because I think we are now at a stage, at least in Alberta and probably in other jurisdictions, where you just can't bring them together. Workers see that's an environmentalist discourse. They want to destroy our jobs. We don't want to call it just transition anymore. which is absolute. It's a shame when you consider that it originates with some of the working class activism in the 70s. But this is where we are. And I do think that this is where within deindustrialization studies, and especially since our interest is also in populism, it's so useful to bring in that energy perspective.
Yeah, if I could just follow up.
Go ahead, Robert. Yep.
Yeah, very briefly. Also, Petra, I think someone asked about the specific author in the chat. Yeah, so I would like to just disagree with Petra and say that words don't matter. I think that's a very popular position for me as a historian to take. No, what I wanted to say was that one thing that I think is really useful here, Stephen, is that the energy transitions literature itself has become so bitterly contested in recent years, where we usually are talking about how energy transitions are messy and slow and contested and politicized. And I think that's something that plays really nicely with deindustrialization studies as well, because these stories of manual labor and horse labor remaining as these kind of holdovers well into the steam age. This is pretty much a story that's repeated for every single energy transition. And I think what the industrialization studies really brings to this is it makes these a lot less kind of bloodless and starts talking about these kinds of persistence narratives as being, it kind of shows how they're hotly contested, not just from kind of the big stakeholders that we usually think of as contesting energy transitions, but also from, labor and the ground up. That's all I wanted to say.
Go ahead, Chad. Yes, please.
I'll just say one more quick thing before we go to the next question. I mean, also, I think we need to remember, I know everybody knows this, but just to put it out there that, part of what we're doing is operating within a context in which corporations very intentionally posed and I think successfully have gotten people to believe that you have to choose between jobs and environment. And if we look at the history of labor unions in the US and at least in Canada, I mean, I don't know about other parts of the world, but I have done work with both countries now. Workers didn't believe that until the 1970s and 80s. But it's part of a corporate campaign. Like, they very intentionally do that. And then when economic change takes place in the 1980s, it creates a different context that also moves things, to the right politically. That makes it really hard for workers not to believe it. And so they get to this point where saying just transition is a bad thing. Like, why wouldn't you want a just transition? If there's going to be transition, why not make it just? Why would you disagree with that, right? And that's where we're at, this baffling moment. And also where people are resisting planning. Like, if there's going to be a change, why not make it planned? Why does it have to be chaos, and hurt people? But we as scholars are part of that too. Like, our discussion that we're having is like, we're not special in some way that our conversation about energy or labor or gender is somehow we can have some more sort of objective perspective, and maybe that's part of the discussion that's going on within energy history studies or energy policy studies.
Okay, good. Thanks, Chad. Layla, you've been waiting very patiently to ask your questions.
Yes, I think I got a part of my answer already while I was waiting anyway. Thank you, everyone. It was a fantastic panel today. My name is Layla. I'm a postdoc at the University of St. Andrews, and I work on urban transformations in Baku, in Azerbaijan, where the industrialization and the development of oil industry are kind of happening at the same time in the context of these discussions of, inevitable, presumably, energy transition, presumably because a lot of people in Baku don't believe that, but also the context of the post kind of socialist transition that is still not seen as completed. And I am a qualitative sociologist. I work kind of on a very micro level with everyday life and the narratives that people use in everyday life. And it's very difficult for me to see things in a more historical perspective. So I was wondering if historians who are working on like oil, like Amber and Petra, who mentioned oil at least, Amber, Petra, and maybe also Robert, could comment on how they see this relationship between like coal, oil, and the industrialization. And I'm also interested because like a lot of literature that I read on the relationship between energy and the industrialization is about coal, and oil has some similarities, but also some differences. So yeah, if like you could comment on that, it would be very helpful for my work. Thank you.
I don't know whether anyone wants to go first. If not, I mean, we are very familiar with Mitchell's argument, right? That they're so connected to sort of political forms such as democracy or not, that there is much more possibilities in the coal industry through strikes and these things to actually have a political voice that maybe, you know, you don't have with oil, which is reliant on a very different kind of workforce, not as centralized, not as organized. The infrastructure is different. It may not lend itself as easily to interruption, disruption, and all that. While I think this is a very important argument, I don't necessarily agree with it. I think many energy historians don't necessarily agree with that. It's a very kind of generalized good way into this kind of discussion. As I mentioned before, I know that Alice Maha, who's also part of this group, of course, she works more on the oil side and has some really interesting insights. But generally, I do think the reason why we hear so much more around coal and deindustrialization is maybe because industrialization is so closely connected with that story of coal. And I think it's easy to forget that, right? Most of us are really kind of, that's the narrative that we have been, and I mean, even concepts of the Anthropocene, the Great Acceleration, they all start, right, with that discussion of how significant coal, and of course you should say it's always just it's the combination of coal and steam, right? Because coal in itself, that's not but it is so integral for us to understand industrialization, the Anthropocene, that I think it's not surprising that we also have in discussions on deindustrialization, the prominence of coal. But beyond that, there are many more factors. I do think that the way that coal attracts much more either company towns or, entire kind of families rather than sort of single men who are very mobile. Right. So I know for the Canadian context, we have a very early oil industry in the kind of second half of the 19th century. It dries out very quickly. And these people they travel all over the world. They're in what is today Indonesia. They go to the US, they go to everywhere. That's not, even though on a lesser level, it is the story on coal. We have a lot of coal miners who go to North America and make up, but I think it's just a different kind of story. We're still grappling with that. I'm looking at Robert and Anna, who's hiding somewhere here. In our research group, we've discussed it so many times. So what is the difference between coal and oil? Is there a difference? Should we make that point? And I'd be really interested if anyone else has some, ideas about that. But I do think there's something to be said about the difference there. Coal and steel versus oil and petrochemicals, very different kind of stories.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Amber.
Oh no, I was just going to quickly say, so thanks, Robert, that I completely agree with you, Petra, and that coal and oil, completely different narratives, especially in a UK context where the end of coal is linked with Thatcher. It's linked with the end of something, of a whole way of life, and crucially, it's linked with the end of unionised labour in Britain, because that was one of our most strongly, densely unionised sectors. And once that broke up, the narrative is the UK was on a very, very different economic and political trajectory. But I think that I'd like to draw on what Petra, you were saying earlier, and I think also William, about this concept of bringing in this idea of transition. which isn't, I agree, it isn't as politicized as deindustrialization, but I think it can shed light on how the end of coal, say in Britain or in other countries, isn't just the end of something, but it's also at the same time involved the arrival of new modes of exploitation and indeed new modes of alienation, which is what I think we quite often think about when we think of the oil industry. The fact that it's often defined by what it isn't, especially in a UK, sorry, I can only speak for the UK, but it's not unionized. It's so, it's so mobile as well. And it's not really tied to place and communities in the same way. So that's where I think that possibly, if we are to have, there doesn't need to be one universal meta-narrative to describe what's going on locally and globally. You can have deindustrialization, which is wonderful for all that kind of political, how politicized it is, but then transition for what it, the totalizing agency of that word of transition, I think is so powerful. And I think that one narrative can inform the other. If energy transition is sort of, this, it has become this a bit more of a sort of depoliticized thing. Well, let's politicize it now. Let's look at how capital is always moving and evolving in modes of exploitation and alienation. So that would just be quickly my comment on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there are two things that I'd want to add from a North American context about the differences between coal and oil. So the first one being that in extraction, yeah, I think there is this fundamental difference. I think one of the things you see with North American oil industries, both in Alberta and in the United States, is that the places that are kind of the locuses of those industries aren't actually the extraction points. They're the kind of finance, headquarters, refining points. Those are where they really focus. And so since the fuel itself is mobile and usually shipped to the refineries, and since capital is highly mobile, that means that you don't get that same kind of ramp off effect that you do with coal, where you have these kind of permanent towns that stick around for generations before they die away. And I think that's why, in one way, you almost never get an oil deindustrialization narrative. It's because the people who are actually working on oil fields tend to be more itinerant anyway. The other thing that I was going to say, also just a thought that I've been having increasingly about the North American context, and since Petra brought up Tim Mitchell's work, I think there might be a lot of value, and I guess I would say this because this is what I'm doing, but I think there would be a lot of value in looking at this kind of broad meta-narrative, not only from the extraction side, but also from the use side, of asking what changes about labor relations in an economy that is dominated by oil on the labor level, as opposed to one that is dominated by steam on the labor level. And is there something about that that does make it less capable of like cross-class, working class solidarity? And I think there is. And I would like to argue that in my book. So no one steal that, please. Thank you.
If I could just jump in there quickly, Greg.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
To add to that, I mean, I think Robert said a lot of what I would say when we think about that coal versus oil or coal to oil transition or whatever. But I would also say, I think it's messier than we maybe think. Those divisions are not as clear cut as we think. Because I think if you look at coal production in the second half of the 20th century, I know it best in the North American context, but the labor relations there start to look a lot more like what we see in the oil industry, right? The hugely mechanized open pit mines in places like Wyoming's Powder River Valley or mountaintop removal mining that Chad talks about. And my understanding is few, if any of these remain unionized, and the workforce is far more itinerant. And they're essentially bought off, right? The trade-off is to say we're just going to have as few workers as we can and put the capital into machines. And those workers who are here are going to be very well paid and tied into a kind of like, it's not petro masculinity because it's coal, I guess, but it's like fossil masculinity, right? We'll pay six-figure salaries for sort of like a boys and their toys kind of thing. So they get big trucks and guns and things like that. So in some ways, it's like coal, which still exists, of course, has adopted some of those labor labor management techniques from the oil industry. So I think in some ways it is goes back to that central idea that these transitions are just much more nuanced and blurrier and less clear cut than it appears at first glance.
Thank you all so much. It's like really a lot to think about.
Yeah.
I know of Mitchell's work, of course, but like one of my difficulties with it is that it seems to me that like a lot of what has been found for other places in the world seems not to quite work in Baku, perhaps because of the socialism period, because like there was the community, there was no this like hyper mobility of labor and these things that we usually sort of associate with the oil industry. So it's like in a way it's different, while it's like very much inserted in the whole global capitalist oil system and always was. So yeah, thank you so much. It's really very thought provoking.
Yeah, good. Yeah, one thing to add too, you know, is the hydraulic fracturing, right? The fracking industry, which kind of is coal. It's not coal, but it's oil and gas, but it's local, right? But it's global. So anyway, just another area study, right? Something else to consider if you're thinking about that narrative, right? Where that what space that occupies in that discussion too. So anyway,
I just want to read out a comment from Anna. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead.
So she says, I agree with Amber. The migratory aspect and the job mobility are prevalent aspects when considering oil and gas extraction. People don't connect as much to space and place as we can see with coal. So this whole idea of sense of place. And I believe that this constant moving makes it difficult for an historian or an ethnographer to be able to exactly understand how deindustrialization in this context is happening. That's a very good point in terms of methods, right? It's easier to reach out to communities who remained in places and you can talk to them than to those who are much more itinerant, elusive. Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. Gab, you had your hand up a while ago. Did you have a question or were you coming from the chat? Sorry, I don't think if I missed you, apologize.
Yeah, no, I do have a question since we have
okay, go ahead.
And this kind of riffs off of what Anna pointed out too, but a lot of the presentations, especially those couched in a North American context, made me think of settler colonial studies and the insight that you get from that literature about how a settler colonial identity and sense of place is really forged through the interactions that you have with a given landscape, including manual and extractive labor and resource use and the kind of resources that you find in a place. So I guess my question is a little bit vague, but how do energy transitions destabilize structures of settler colonialism, if at all, or at least intersect with that structure?
Chad, yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is something that, so I've only been this is my excuse. I've been in Calgary for 2 months, and so I haven't been doing this research very long, looking at labor's role in making an environmental movement in Canada. But one of the things that I noticed very quickly that was different from work that I've done on the United States and organized labor there is that Canadian labor activists, at least by the early 70s, but certainly by the end of the 70s, are aligning themselves with what I think at that time, the nomenclature is different around the country, but Native rights, Native American rights organizations. And when they have a Jobs and Environment Conference in Ottawa in 1978 that the Canadian Labour Congress sponsored, 25 of the delegates there are from Native groups. And there's a lot of correspondence that's going on where people are talking about how can we work with Indigenous people in different parts of the country where development is being proposed or taking place already. And Indigenous people are reaching out to labor, right? And so I think there's a way that in their doing labor activism and environmental activism, they're also beginning to question this longer history of colonization, and labor's aware of, labor's open to that. And it's not that labor in America isn't, it has a closed mind to it. It just never comes up. Like the people that are doing stuff in North America just never think about it. And Native Americans in the United States don't think about reaching out to labor either.
I would add a different comment from a different angle, and that's if you look at the discussions around the coming energy transition, where we kind of all seem to have a clear idea where this is moving toward. There's of course the argument proposed by some that this is really highlighting increasingly decentralized energy systems, which allows for more local autonomy or sovereignty over this. And this feeds into, and you might, I'm sure you're aware for the Canadian context, into this whole discussion around Indigenous energy sovereignty. So it is a lot easier to then, of course, pursue and promote local or regional energy systems that do not rely on global infrastructures and so on and so forth. So there's at least the hope, right, with the coming energy transition, that this is one that would allow a lot more Indigenous energy sovereignty. Whether that is the case, I do not know, but I do think that that's what makes it so attractive for some of these actors. And we do have, there's I think it's a radio show by Melinda, what's her name, Labukan, Power to the People, who actually highlights a lot of Indigenous renewable energy projects, particularly in the North, which of course, despite the global nature of fossil fuels, is really often shut out of these existing infrastructures. So I do think there is some, hope, and there is some discussion around how a different type of energy system to which we might transition will allow for a lot more local autonomy and sovereignty.
Thanks, Petra. Well, we've got a couple minutes, so unless if anybody has one last comment, a short one, but I'll just take a minute again just to thank everyone for great presentations, great discussion, fantastic all around. So well done, and keeping the depot project moving along quite well, right? As we think about the environmental thread or theme that's coming up here, right, as we move along. So great. And thanks for allowing me to chair it. It was fantastic. So Gab, thanks for helping out as always, and doing the presentation for Anna, for Anna, and I hope you feel better soon. So, all right, well, that's it, everyone. Thanks again for everyone who joined, and keep joining everything that we do for the project. There'll be more workshops, presentations. So we want to spread this out as widely as we can. So thanks from wherever you are in the world. We appreciate you joining us. So au revoir, goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. And do reach out to us if you're interested in this particular topic.
Yes.